Job chapters 18 and 19. You may remember the coverage back in 2014 of the Metropolitan Police searching the flat of Sir Cliff Richard as part of Operation Yewtree, set up to deal with accusations of historic child abuse. Though he was not arrested and denied the allegations throughout, coverage by the media, in particular the BBC, was extensive and damning. He was likened to other influential men against whom evidence had been found and convictions had been secured, such as Jimmy Savile and Stuart Hall. As a consequence, Sir Cliff withdrew from many of his public engagements, stating that he did not want the events to be overshadowed by the false allegations. Over a period of 2 years, investigations were carried out by South Yorkshire Police and the conclusions handed to the Crown Prosecution Service. They decided that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. Subsequent litigation cases brought by Sir Cliff revealed the distress caused to him by the television coverage and police investigation. In one statement, Sir Cliff said that he had been hung out like live bait and that the TV coverage had been shocking and upsetting. This is but one example, though sadly there are many others, of trial by media. Newspaper and television coverage present facts before they are presented in a court of law, so swaying public opinion and pronouncing guilt usually, and publicly condemning the celebrity involved, acting as prosecutor, judge, jury and executioner in a very public sphere. As we approach these next chapters of Job, we see that what started as lively debate between Job and his friends as they considered what might be the cause of Job's suffering has now become personal attack on both sides. In chapter 12, Job had said to his friends that he would be better off listening to the animals than to them. He feels they do not understand his situation because they keep making the same arguments over and again. Now, in a deeply personal counterattack, Bildad links the symptoms of Job's suffering directly with a description of the punishment of the wicked, offering it as proof that Job's suffering is a consequence of his sin. Much as the media do in celebrity scandals, Bildad appoints himself as Job's judge. As we look through these next 2 chapters of Job, we'll see Bildad's condemnation of him. We'll see Job's despair at his friends' attitudes and his situation. And we'll see Job's prophetic realization that God is alive. Well, let's start by looking at Bildad's condemnation of Job. In verses 1 to 4 of chapter 18, he starts out by saying that Job lacks understanding, and so there's no point talking to him. He bases Job's lack of understanding on Job's likening of his friends to animals, and his desire that God will change the nature of the universe to accommodate him by giving him an audience so he can plead his case. For Bildad, this is foolishness on Job's part. For Bildad, the die has already been cast. There is nothing for Job to plead with God over, because sin causes suffering, and as Job is suffering, then he must be a wicked man. In the verses that follow, Bildad uses Job's own words against him. In chapter 17, verse 12, Job had spoken out, saying, "Yet the desires of my heart turn night into day. In the face of the darkness, light is near," clinging on to that one final hope that he had of an audience with God. Now Bildad turns Job's cry of despair into a statement of proof that the light has gone out in Job, that he is a wicked man. He says in verses 5 and 6, the lamp of a wicked man is snuffed out, the flame of his fire stops burning, the light in his tent becomes dark, the lamp beside him goes out. Then, taking Job's statement from chapter 16, verse 7, that God had worn him out, Bildad turns this too into a characteristic of a wicked person. In verse 7 he says, "The vigour of his step is weakened, his own schemes throw him down. Then, going into full overkill mode, Bildad takes Job's complaint that he is the prey of God the hunter from chapter 10 verse 6 and identifies not one but 6 different kinds of hunting traps that Job might be caught in the darkness. In verses 8 to 10, Bildad speaks of a net, mesh, a snare, a noose, and 2 types of trap. Bildad is completely locked in to his point of view that Job is being punished for his wickedness. In verses 11 to 19, Bildad lists all the events that have placed Job in his current position. His exile to an ash heap, the strangers who have taken over his tents, the fire that consumed his livestock and servants, his loss of reputation, the scorn of his people, his children's death, and the loss of his property. All these, say Bildad, are symptoms of sin. Job has become an example of the fact that suffering is caused by sin. In verse 20, Bildad says, "People of the west are appalled at his fate. Those of the east are seized with horror." Word has gone out about Job's predicament, and those who hear of it are astonished and shocked. For Bildad, there is only one conclusion to be drawn, which he makes in verse 21. "Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man. Such is the place of one who does not know God." Bildad has lined up all the facts in a logical order, but come to a preconceived conclusion. Bildad doesn't feel anguish for Job as a friend would. He has absolute certainty. There is no room for questions in his doctrine. And he's been willing to resort to any means, including twisting Job's own words against him to justify his position. With not even a shadow of remorse or regret, Bildad condemns Job to the place of the wicked. When we read accounts like these in the Bible, or indeed in other books, we often place ourselves in the position of the protagonist, the main character. We see ourselves as Joseph, the dreamer, or Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, the prodigal son who returned home, or Job in his suffering. It's good to empathise like this, but to focus on only one character gives us a limited perspective. When we place ourselves in Job's position, we focus, as he did, on our own situation, our own suffering. And it's good and right to do so when we consider whether the way we deal with our suffering is a way that God finds pleasing. However, we also need to place ourselves in the position of Job's friends, today in Bildad's position. If we do this, we begin to look at our actions towards others. We consider how we respond to someone who is suffering. Do we, like Bildad, allow the axe of condemnation to fall on those who turn to us for help? Do we believe they've brought their situation upon themselves? Do we offer no comfort, no way out, only judgment? Let's use this passage to reflect on our own attitudes to others who are suffering. Well, as we turn to chapter 19, our focus returns to Job. We see his despair at his friends' attitudes and his situation. Job expected help from his friends. Instead, they torment him. In verses 1 to 5, Job admits to his friends that their words torment him, that they leave him broken and lonely. But he says in verse 4, "If it's true that I have gone astray, my error remains my concern alone." The issue is between Job and God, not Job and his friends. And there's no evidence of Job's sin. His friends have produced no evidence of it, and he hasn't harmed anyone. Moreover, Job's friends are making a personal case against him, persecuting him as though they were God themselves. In verse 5, Job says to them, "If indeed you would exalt yourselves above me and use my humiliation against me." Job now has exposed the flaw in their logic. God has not pronounced him guilty. His friends have presumed to know God's mind with their own declaration of his guilt, and they've spoken before God does. Though there is no pronouncement of guilt, Job is sure that the assaults on him are from God. In verse 6 he says, "Know that God has wronged me and drawn his net around me." In verses 6 to 12 we hear Job's continued despair as he lists his plight. He is entangled in a net, walled in by a fence, set on a dark path, stripped of his crown, broken into rubble, uprooted like a tree, counted as an enemy and under siege by armies. The list of woes continues in verses 13 to 19. He's in need of solace, respect, family intimacy. Yet instead, his brothers avoid him. He's estranged by his acquaintances. He's failed by relatives and forgotten by friends. His servants alienate and ignore him. His wife has rejected him. His children are repulsed by him. Even street urchins despise him. He is abhorred and betrayed by friends and loved ones. Job is at rock bottom. He can only wish that his words were written down, recorded for future generations. In verses 23 to 24, he says, "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever." Job remains firm in his belief that he is innocent before God, but now recognises that he may not be vindicated while he is alive. He can only look to the future and hope that his vindication will come after his death. And this brings us to Job's prophetic realisation that God is alive. In words familiar to us from funeral services that speak of eternal hope, Job declares in verses 25 to 27, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." Hear the certainty as Job says, "I know." As Isaiah saw the Lord sitting on a throne, and as John in Revelation was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, so Job has been given a glimpse of the hope of Jesus, the atonement he offers, his incarnation and resurrection. The word for Redeemer is the same one used in the book of Ruth as applied to Boaz of kinsman redeemer, a relative who defends or pleads the cause of another relative. The word is also used as a title for Yahweh, the covenant God, redeeming Israel from Babylon. Job could be talking about a future relative. He could also be talking about God. Job realises that he cannot stand before God in his own righteousness. His blameless behaviour is not enough. So Job places his hope in a Redeemer who will vindicate him in the future, foreseeing the atonement of sins by Jesus on the cross. Job continues, speaking of the Redeemer, saying, "He shall stand at last on the earth." Job has not received the law. He's not received the covenant from God. Yet by God's grace, he envisions the time described by John the Evangelist when the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God and humanity, heaven and earth, life and death, are all joined together in the incarnation of Christ. Job further declares that he will see God. He believes that he will become a first-hand witness of his Redeemer. "My eyes shall behold," he says. He foresees the resurrection, and it is sufficient to anchor his hope and help him through his suffering. This divine revelation of the Redeemer will be Job's focus point when pain and pressure become intolerable. But Job has a final warning for his friends. If he is to be vindicated by the God of justice, it means his friends will also have to stand under judgment for their treatment of him. He warns them against playing God, saying that their judgment of him will bring God's judgment on them. However, Job, rather than judging as his friends do, is willing to let God decide. So Job, in his suffering, was given a divine revelation that offered him comfort in his present circumstances, that there was hope for the future. Like Job, we can hope that our suffering will be vindicated by our Redeemer, and that we can look forward to the resurrection, knowing that we will meet our Redeemer face to face. We remember Job's response to that revelation, "How my heart yearns within me." And let us pray that that may be our own response to knowing Jesus, our Redeemer.